National's EQC spokesperson believes the Earthquake Commission should sue Fletcher Building if there's compelling evidence the contractor was responsible for a large number of post-earthquake repairs in Christchurch that went up to scratch. Earlier in the program, we heard from a couple who bought a house in Christchurch post-quake for $350,000, believing it had been repaired by EQC. That's what the paperwork said, only to discover it hadn't, and the re-repairs will cost them $380,000 more than they originally paid for the home. Stuart Smith, who told us he'd received a handover briefing from his predecessor, Jerry Brownlee, the man who held the portfolio for 6 years after the earthquakes, says a case can be made for Fletcher Building assuming liability. If that happens, it would be a total departure from previous advice to EQC that the contract they signed with Fletchers exempted the company from liability for substandard repairs. Stuart Smith was reacting to the number of homeowners in Christchurch who are only now finding out the extent of the damage to their properties. It was an unprecedented event, he says. Yes, absolutely. But for this to still be happening 7 years on?
Yeah, look, I think the first thing to say is that I have great sympathy for those people, and it's something that shouldn't have happened. However, it has, and we have to deal with what's in front of us. Really, we were unprepared for what happened in front of us, and such a big number of claims that were coming the way of EQC and the insurance industry, which we didn't really have under the Act. The Act only required EQC to make a cash payment to those people who had damaged homes. However, had that just happened on its own, the likely effect of that would have been probably a situation far worse than we have today. The issue and the way that it was decided to deal with that was to do a managed repair program, and so that's what happened. Fletchers managed that, and through their contractors. And as we know, some of those repairs were not up to standard, and that's what we are talking about now.
What do you make of those initial assessments? And your point is absolutely central to all of this. It was such a big event. And prior to the Christchurch earthquakes in 2011, there was I think 20 permanent staff at EQC. 180,000 rapid assessments were done in the 2 months after the earthquakes. What do you make of the quality of some of that work?
Well, clearly some of it wasn't up to standard. I mean, I'd have to admit I was nervous about it at the time. Now, I didn't have first-hand experience with those assessments, but my parents had an EQC assessment on their house done by someone who was a retired policeman, I believe. Now, I've got nothing against retired policemen, but unless they have building or an insurance assessment experience, it does make me a little nervous, or it did make me nervous at the time.
What needs to happen to those people who, through no fault of their own, particularly when there is EQC paperwork telling them the house they are about to buy is fine, have bought a house that isn't fine? What happens now?
Well, there are avenues through the courts, and that's where it's going to be now. The liability will lie with Fletchers and how they recover that from their contractors. If they do, that will be over to them.
The liability doesn't lie with Fletchers, though, does it? Because Fletchers wouldn't actually take on the role of effectively managing the Canterbury home repair program if the liability lay with them. Well,
I believe it does. That's my understanding. So EQC had an arrangement with for the managed repairs through Fletchers, and so they hired them to do work. If it's not up to standard and didn't meet what was paid for, then there's recourse through the courts for that.
I'm looking at the Auditor General's report that says none of the bidders for the project management services were willing to accept liability for substandard repair work. In other words, actually, ultimately, the buck stops with EQC in contractual terms.
Yeah, well, look, I'm not a lawyer. I assume that this will end up in court, and those things will be sorted out in the courts. But if you contract anyone to do something and they don't meet their contractual obligation, then whether they've accepted liability or not, the courts will assign liability and recover the costs.
So if it becomes apparent that there is an enormous amount of substandard repair work, a problematic amount of it, would you expect EQC to pursue Fletchers in court?
Absolutely.
Which seemed to be a radical change of National's position on this. We called Fletchers to see what their response to that was. Remember, none of this action is taking place, and in fact we asked EQC about it last week and they said they would not be pursuing Fletchers in court. Fletchers were once again not available for comment.